Okay, I wanted to create a quick video to go over a couple topics. First one is multi-platform because I talk about it a lot and I want to explain it. The second is going to be use cases, and I don't know if it's a third topic, but use cases and then tests with those use cases. So quickly, multi-platform in a nutshell. When I talk about it, basically you're able to write the way I use it in one language, being Kotlin, and I'm able to reuse a lot of the code. So traditionally, if I was writing, let's say, a blog application, which this is a sample of, I would have to create a server, which would traditionally be written in Java, which would handle my database, saving the stuff, and then basically what's called a REST interface on that server, which would allow me to push data out and take data in. And when the in and out would be in reference to a client communicating with that service. The client would then be written in HTML and JavaScript, or an Android app, or it would be an iOS app. Um, but basically, you write your application so that the server is agnostic to the client. The client looks inwards towards the server and communicates with the server. That being said, for something like a blog post, I'd have to write code on the server to describe what a blog post is. I would have to then write client code also to describe in the different language. If it's a JavaScript, I gotta write a JavaScript version of what a blog post is. If it's an iPhone app, I gotta write a Swift version, right? So with multi-platform, I get to write basically in one language, which is Kotlin, for both server side and right now Android and JavaScript, and they're working on the iOS iPhone version. Not there yet. So I'm going to do a quick example or a quick explanation. Just real quick, I use these DTO objects, and this is what the server will take in and out. And it's a description of what a blog post is. Title, description, content. Really basically simple. And now I'm able to use that in my controller. My controller is taking this in and basically on a create and returning it when it's filled out and has all the database specific information, the ID, date created, date updated. That's fantastic. Um, I'm also able to use this on my client side. This is a client side, which would normally be written in JavaScript and React. Well, I've written Kotlin React. So now I'm not writing any JavaScript anymore, just Kotlin. It's great. So here you can see that I'm referencing that DTO. Didn't have to create it in a separate directory or reference it or create a version of it for my client. It's using the blog post DTO. It's fantastic. If I create an Android app, it's going to use the same blog post DTO. I'm not going to have to create a separate version. Okay? I think you can understand where we're going with this. Now, let's talk about use cases. So I'm talking to you guys, and I'm saying, hey, I need to ask you some questions. I'm creating use cases. What does that mean? Well, what I do then with those questions I ask you is I create these silly little use cases and try and decide, like, what does every button click kind of do, or what's the meat and potatoes of what the app actually does. Let's break it down into smaller portions. So in reference to a blog app, and in reference to a blog app's blog posts, um, we need to create, delete, update in a nutshell, right? So I create these use cases, and this use case, if you think of it, it's almost like a contract maybe. And what it basically says is, and the request is coming from the client, if the client gives me a DTO of a new blog post to create, it's going to have all that information I showed you before, but like no ID, the date updated, date created, because it has that's in reference to the database, saving it. That isn't available. Well, what this is going to do is it's basically going to take in that DTO that I talked about before, and if it's successful, it is going to spit out that DTO with the database information in it. And then you can see again in my controller, I'm literally referencing that use case, that contract that we talked about, right? So it would be nice if I was able to know ahead of time if these things work. Well, now I'm able to write these tests, and in my test, again, I'm referencing that blog post create use case that I talked about and the code that was generated to fulfill it. Um, what's wonderful about that is instead of when you're testing this stuff out, the meat and potatoes of your app. Normally, if I didn't have these tests, I'd have to fire up the server, fire up the client, log in to the client because you have your security layer. Any application that's well along is going to have a security layer. Got to type in a username and password. I'd have to navigate to the blog post create page, fill the data in, hit the save button, and then I could see if the server could handle it. Well, now because I have that contract that I showed you, I can write these tests and I can fire them all off at once. So I have my blog post create test, and then it uses that code that I showed you, and it basically gives me back a response, and then I just do a comparison on that response. I basically look at what was ingested and what came out, and just make sure it still matches up. And that's the way I know that create blog post use case works. And then in my experience in doing this, I haven't had any issues with then taking this and using the client, because the client, as long as it fulfills the contract specified in the use case, it's going to get back what the contract says it's going to get back, and you write around that. So real quick, just to show you, so I've written a whole bunch of use cases for this one, and I can run them, and you see here it's going to fire up. Now these are a little bit longer. If I didn't have the database in there, they would run faster, but it makes me feel better knowing that literally if these run, the server is going to work. So you can see all the different use cases I've created just for this specific instance, and they're all green, they work. So now if I fire up my server and I want to show off the UI, I'm able to come here. Let me refresh. Now I got an auto login script that logs me in as my author. But here you can see it can come down. I can list all these posts. These are all generated randomly. And then I can update them. So let's say I want to add an image to this. I can come through and throw an image now on this blog post. And now I can hit the update button, which basically uses that save or update use case I showed you. And now I'll do a refresh, which basically resets me, makes me log in again. And then now, if I look at that one we just updated, you can see it was saved correctly. I mean, it's wonderful. That is the beauty of use cases, and I guess the beauty of multi-platform as well.